The air inside Greystone Federal Penitentiary was thick with sweat, regret, and the smell of steel and disinfectant. Sergeant Daniel Kane sat motionless in his death row cell, staring at the cracks in the concrete wall, feeling the weight of time slipping away. Outside, the clock was ticking. He had 72 hours left to live, 3 days before the state would strap him down, insert the IV, and erase his name like he'd never existed. For a crime he didn't commit. For a murder he didn't even see happen. The entire world believed he was a traitor, a killer. But Daniel, he was just a soldier who got caught in someone else's war. 2 years ago, Daniel had been a respected Army Ranger, decorated for his service in combat zones most people didn't even know existed. Now, he was a dead man walking. They said he killed Senator Robert Calloway, a man deeply connected to military contracts and national defense. The evidence? The murder weapon was found in his apartment. His fingerprints were on the gun. And worst of all, a witness, a former squad mate, testified that he had been near the crime scene that night. A perfect frame-up. Daniel had tried to fight it, tried to scream the truth until his throat was raw. Nobody cared. The system had buried him alive. And now, they were ready to finish the job. The prison warden, a broad-shouldered man with a face like a cinder block, leaned against the bars of Daniel's cell. "You got any last requests, Kane?" Daniel barely looked at him. "No steak dinner, no cigarettes, no bullshit," the warden continued. "You get one thing. Make it count." Daniel took a slow breath. "There's something I want." The warden sighed. "Let me guess. A retrial?" Daniel's hands clenched. "I want to see my K9 partner." Silence. The warden frowned. "What?" Daniel looked up, his dark eyes locked onto the man like a sniper's scope. "My dog, Thor. He served with me for 5 years. I want to see him. One last time." The warden rubbed his jaw, considering. "That's a first." "He's the only family I have left," Daniel said, his voice like gravel. "You gonna tell me no?" The warden exhaled heavily. "I'll see what I can do." They didn't let Daniel see Thor in his cell. Too risky. Instead, they brought him to a courtroom inside the prison. A room where executions were reviewed, last-minute appeals were denied, and men like Daniel had their fates signed, stamped, and sealed. A few people sat behind the glass in the observation area. His lawyer, who had all but given up on his case. A few journalists, sniffing for a good story. And the prosecutor, the same smug bastard who had put him here. Daniel ignored them all. He only cared about one thing. The metal doors swung open, and there he was, Thor. The massive Belgian Malinois stepped inside, led by his new handler, his movements sharp, precise, a military dog to his core. But the second Thor locked eyes with Daniel, everything changed. Thor froze. The dog's ears twitched, his entire body stiffened. Daniel had spent years in war zones. He knew what hesitation meant. Thor was processing something. And then, in one swift, explosive movement, Thor lunged. The handler yelped, struggling to hold him back. But Thor yanked against the leash, his muscles straining, his paws skidding against the tiled floor. The room gasped. "Stand down, Thor!" the handler barked. But Thor wasn't attacking. He was desperate, whining, pawing at the floor, trying to get to Daniel. Daniel's breath hitched. "Jesus!" someone whispered. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Release the leash," Daniel ordered, his voice steady. The handler hesitated. "Do it." The handler let go, and Thor bolted. The massive war dog slammed into Daniel, knocking his chair backward. Daniel hit the ground with the full weight of 90 pounds of muscle and fur pinning him down. Thor wasn't attacking, he was sobbing. Daniel choked back something deep, something painful. The dog pressed his head against Daniel's chest, his tail wagging so hard it smacked against the chair legs, his entire body trembling. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, his arms wrapping around the one living thing that had never abandoned him. "I missed you too, boy," he whispered. The room was silent. No one moved, no one breathed. Because this wasn't normal. K9S were trained for discipline, for detachment. When they were reassigned, they moved on. But Thor hadn't moved on. He had been waiting, and now he was reacting to something more than just reunion. He was remembering. And then something even stranger happened. Thor suddenly froze. His tail stopped wagging, his ears pinned back, and then he growled, but not at Daniel, at someone else in the room. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Thor's entire body went rigid, his muscles coiling like a spring ready to snap. His eyes locked onto one man, the prosecutor, the bastard who had put him here. The man stiffened. "The hell is wrong with this dog?" the prosecutor muttered, shifting in his seat. But Thor didn't stop. He didn't blink. His growl deepened, his lips pulling back to expose razor-sharp teeth. And suddenly, Daniel knew. Thor wasn't just happy to see him. He wasn't just remembering their bond. He was remembering something else, something that had happened the night of the murder, something that no one else knew. And if Thor was growling at the prosecutor, then maybe, just maybe, Daniel Cain wasn't the only man in this room who knew the truth. The low growl rippled through the air, deep and primal. The kind that vibrated through the floor, the kind that made every person in the room freeze. Thor's hackles stood on end, his muscular frame locked in place, his amber eyes burning with something dangerous. But he wasn't growling at Daniel. He was locked onto the prosecutor, the man who had put him here, the man who had argued for his execution. For the first time since Daniel had been dragged into this courtroom in shackles, the prosecutor looked nervous. He shifted in his seat, eyes flicking toward the guards, as if waiting for them to step in. Thor's growl deepened. Daniel could feel the vibrations in his chest, his hands gripping the fur along the dog's back. Because he knew this growl, it wasn't just aggression, it was recognition. Thor remembered something, and whatever it was, the prosecutor was part of it. The judge finally cleared his throat. "Control your dog, Sergeant Cain." Daniel barely blinked. "He's not my dog anymore, Your Honor," he said, voice calm but laced with steel. "And yet, he's reacting like this. Why do you think that is?" Murmurs spread through the room. The judge frowned. "Lieutenant Morales," he addressed Thor's new handler. "Explain this." The young officer was sweating now. Sir, I don't know. He's never done this before." Daniel's lips curled. Maybe because he's never been in a room with the real killer before. The entire courtroom snapped to attention. The prosecutor laughed, but it was thin, shaky. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "Dogs don't solve murders. This is just some emotional manipulation." Thor snarled, and for the first time, the prosecutor flinched. Daniel took a slow breath, his mind racing. If Thor remembered something, if he was reacting to the prosecutor, then there was only one possible explanation. Thor had been there the night of the murder, and someone had made sure his footage never saw the light of day. Daniel's eyes snapped to his lawyer. "Did they ever pull body cam footage from Thor?" His lawyer blinked. "They said it was corrupted. The files were lost." Daniel clenched his jaw. Bullshit. Military K9 footage was backed up in 3 places. If it had been lost, it was because someone deleted it on purpose. And now, Thor was giving them the answer. "Your Honor," Daniel's lawyer said, stepping forward, "I request an immediate retrieval of any and all existing files from Thor's service records, including backups." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "This is a waste of time." Daniel leaned forward, eyes locked onto the man. "Then why are you sweating?" The judge, clearly unnerved, ordered a recess while the court scrambled to retrieve the missing files. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in a holding cell, staring at the concrete wall, his fists clenched. Thor sat beside him, pressed against his leg. The dog hadn't calmed down, because he still knew something was wrong. A guard knocked on the bars. "They're bringing you back in. They found something." Daniel's pulse hammered. He stood, took one last look at Thor, and whispered, "Let's finish this." The truth uncovered. The courtroom was a different place now. The prosecutor sat rigid, his jaw tight. The judge looked grim, as if he already knew something was wrong. A forensic analyst sat at the stand. "Your Honor," the analyst began, adjusting her glasses, "we were able to recover portions of the missing footage from Sergeant Cain's K9 unit, Thor. What we found contradicts the original case files." The courtroom leaned in. "Play it," the judge ordered. The screen flickered to life. The timestamp read 11:45 p.m., the night of the murder. The video was grainy, shaky, taken from Thor's harness cam. It showed a dimly lit alleyway, a cold night. Then, 2 figures appeared, One of them was Senator Calloway, the second, the prosecutor. The room exploded. Daniel's lawyer shot to his feet. "Who the hell is that?" The analyst continued. The footage clearly shows Mr. Calloway arguing with the prosecution's key witness. Moments later, on screen, the prosecutor pulled a gun. A single shot rang out. Calloway fell. Thor barked, lunging forward. But the prosecutor turned, saw the dog, and pulled something from his coat. A click. The footage glitched, then went black. Silence. Then, the courtroom erupted into chaos. The prosecutor shot to his feet, face pale as death. "This is a setup," he screamed. "That footage is doctored." The judge wasn't buying it. "Guards," he said, voice cold. "Detain him, now." A pair of military officers moved in, grabbing the prosecutor's arms. He thrashed, screaming, "You can't do this! I had no choice!" Daniel stood slowly, watching the man who had stolen his life crumble. He stepped forward, stopping just a foot away. "You framed me," Daniel said, voice like gravel. "Sent me to death row. Took 5 years of my life." The prosecutor's breath was ragged. "They were gonna kill me!" Daniel's lips curled. "They still might." Thor let out a low, satisfied growl. The prosecutor was dragged away, kicking and screaming. "And Daniel," he turned to the judge. "Now, do you believe me?" The judge exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "Sergeant Kane," he said, shaking his head, "you are fully exonerated." Daniel exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt light. But then, the judge hesitated. "There's one last issue." Daniel stiffened. "What now?" The judge sighed. "Thor, as you know, he's still officially a government asset." Daniel's stomach turned cold. They were going to take him away again. Unless... The judge straightened. "Given his role in exposing this cover-up, I am prepared to grant an immediate request for his official retirement." Daniel barely breathed. Could this really be happening? The judge looked him in the eye. "That is, if you're willing to take him." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I was never leaving without him." Thor wagged his tail. For the first time in 5 years, Daniel wasn't alone. And together, they were finally going home. The gavel slammed down, but this time, it wasn't sentencing Daniel Kane to death. It was setting him free. The courtroom was still buzzing with chaos, reporters scrambling to get their stories out, military officials whispering among themselves. But none of it mattered. Because after 5 years on death row, Daniel was finally exonerated. His lawyer shook his hand, tears in her eyes, but Daniel barely registered it. He was focused on one thing: Thor. The massive Belgian Malinois stood at his side, tail wagging, eyes locked onto him, like he had been waiting for this moment all along. For the first time since being dragged into this nightmare, Daniel let out a slow breath. He was free. But that didn't mean he was done. Not yet. The second Daniel stepped outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed like sharks. "Sergeant Kane, what's your next move? How does it feel to have lost 5 years of your life? Do you plan on suing the government?" Daniel ignored them. His eyes scanned the crowd, watching, waiting. Because he knew how the world worked. The people who set him up, the people who knew the truth but let him rot anyway, weren't done with him yet. The prosecutor had been arrested, but he wasn't the only one involved. There was more to this. Someone higher up had orchestrated everything, and Daniel was going to find them. That night, Daniel sat in a small motel room, staring at the ceiling. Thor lay on the floor beside him, his breathing steady, his presence the only thing that still felt real. The world had moved on without him. 5 years gone. His career, dead. His reputation, tainted forever. Even though he had been cleared, the damage was done. And worst of all, someone was still out there, watching. Daniel had spent his entire life following orders. Now, he was making his own. He reached over, ruffling Thor's fur. "You ready, boy?" Thor thumped his tail once, like he understood. Because they both knew. This wasn't over. Step 1. Finding the real mastermind. Daniel didn't waste time. The military had been too quick to close his case, too eager to bury everything under legal paperwork and press releases. That meant one thing: someone powerful still needed him gone. He started with the prosecutor, Leonard Hayes, the man who had put him on death row, the man who had killed Senator Calloway and framed Daniel for it. And now, He was rotting in a military prison. But Daniel had one more question for him. Step 2. The prison visit. Daniel sat across from Leonard Hayes, separated by a bulletproof glass window. The once confident prosecutor was now a shell of himself, his orange jumpsuit a poetic reversal of Daniel's own past. "Well, well," Hayes muttered, picking up the phone receiver. "Death row looks good on you." Daniel didn't react. "You didn't act alone," he said, his voice calm but dangerous. "Who are you working for?" Hayes smirked. "You really think I'm just gonna tell you?" Daniel leaned forward. "You don't have a choice." Hayes hesitated. For the first time, Daniel saw fear in his eyes. Because Hayes knew that Daniel wasn't bound by military law anymore. Knew that if he wanted justice, he wouldn't wait for the courts. Knew that he was dealing with a man who had spent his entire life hunting down threats. And now, Daniel was hunting him. Step 3. The name that changed everything. Hayes licked his lips, eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Finally, he sighed. "You really want to know who set you up?" he muttered. Daniel didn't blink. Hayes leaned in, lowering his voice. "General Marcus Holloway." Daniel felt his blood turn to ice. He had heard that name before. Holloway was one of the most powerful men in the Pentagon, deeply embedded in military operations, intelligence, and, if the rumors were true, black ops projects no one wanted in the public eye. And now, Daniel had proof he was involved. Hayes chuckled darkly. "But you won't get anywhere near him. He's untouchable." Daniel stood. "Yeah?" He gave Thor a small signal under the table. Thor immediately lunged at the glass, snarling, teeth bared. Hayes flinched so hard his chair scraped backward. Daniel smirked. "We'll see about that." Step 4. Taking the fight to Holloway. Daniel knew what had to be done. The legal system wouldn't save him. The government wouldn't take Holloway down. So that meant it was up to him. The last time he had been in a war zone, he had been taking orders. Now, he was writing his own mission, and General Marcus Holloway was the target. Daniel glanced down at Thor. "You ready, boy?" Thor wagged his tail once. Daniel smirked. "Let's go hunt." The moonlight cut across the cracked asphalt of the empty highway as Daniel Kane drove in silence. The world had changed since he had last been free. The streets felt quieter, darker. But maybe that was just him. Maybe that was what happened when a man had spent 5 years on death row, waiting to die for something he didn't do. In the passenger seat, Thor sat alert, his head lifted, ears twitching with every sound. He wasn't relaxed. He could sense what was coming. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel. Good, because this wasn't over. It wasn't over until General Marcus Holloway paid for what he had done. And Daniel, he was going to make sure Holloway felt every second of it. A man like Holloway wasn't going to be easy to find. He was a ghost in the system, too powerful to be arrested, too well connected to be touched. But Daniel didn't need the system. He had something better. He had Frankie Morales. Frankie was exactly the kind of guy who thrived in the shadows, a former Air Force intelligence officer turned black market fixer. If something needed to be found, moved, or erased, Frankie could do it. Daniel pulled into a grimy parking lot behind a rundown bar, stepping out with Thor at his side. A few shady-looking guys stood by the dumpster, watching him carefully. But when they saw Thor, their postures shifted. A war dog meant business. Daniel walked straight to the back door, knocked twice, then once more. The door creaked open, and Frankie Morales smirked at him. "Well, well," Frankie chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "If it isn't the dead man walking." Daniel didn't smile. "I need a location." Frankie sighed, stepping aside. Knew this was coming. Get in. Inside, the room was small, cluttered with old tech, burner phones, encrypted laptops, stacks of paper no one should have had. Frankie sat at his desk, typing into a secured military database that he definitely wasn't supposed to have access to. "You know, tracking down a guy like Holloway?" Frankie muttered. "That's suicide, man. The second you get close, you're dead." Daniel leaned forward. "Then I better not waste time." Frankie exhaled. "All right, look." He tapped the screen. A file popped up, Marcus Holloway's classified itinerary. Daniel's eyes locked onto one thing. "He's in D.C.? Frankie nodded. "High-level military meeting, deep state kind of stuff. Whatever he's into, It's big. Daniel clenched his jaw. Holloway had set him up, let him rot in a cell, and then tried to have him executed to cover it all up. Now, he was about to have a meeting in the most protected city in the world. Daniel leaned back. Perfect. Frankie snorted. Perfect? Kane, you're insane. You can't just walk into a DC military compound and take down a general. Daniel glanced down at Thor. Thor stared back, silent, waiting. Ready? Daniel smirked. I'm not walking in. Daniel knew he couldn't storm a military installation. Holloway was protected, untouchable inside those walls. So there was only one option, make him come out. And the only way to do that, make Holloway think Daniel had something he needed. Daniel sat in a hotel room, a burner phone in one hand, a secured laptop in the other. Frankie had worked his magic, pulling old Black Ops reports and stitching together a fake classified email leak. All Daniel had to do was send it to the right inbox. He typed, "To Brigadier General Marcus Holloway. Subject, missing evidence. We need to talk. You thought this was over. It's not. I have the files, I have the proof. Come alone. You know where." He hit send. Now, all he had to do was wait. Holloway took the bait. Because men like him, they didn't run from threats, they eliminated them. And that's exactly what Daniel was counting on. The meeting place was an abandoned factory just outside the city, a place with no cameras, no law enforcement, no backup. Holloway would bring security. Daniel had Thor. The black SUV pulled up right on time. Daniel stood in the shadows, watching through his scope. The back door opened, and there he was. Marcus Holloway. Dressed in a tailored suit, the face of a man who had built a career off the backs of soldiers like Daniel. He stepped out, flanked by 2 armed bodyguards. Daniel took a slow breath. Thor tensed beside him. "Wait for it," Daniel whispered. The guards scanned the area. One of them muttered into his earpiece. "We're clear." Holloway took a step forward. Daniel stepped into the light. The moment Holloway saw him, his face twisted into shock. "You," he breathed. Daniel smirked. "Miss me?" The guards immediately raised their weapons. Holloway held up a hand. "Stand down." The guards hesitated but obeyed. "You made a mistake coming here," Holloway said, his voice calm, but his eyes flickered with something nervous. Daniel took another step forward. "You tried to have me killed." Holloway smiled slightly. "I tried to clean up a mess." Daniel's fist clenched. "That mess was my life." Holloway sighed. "What do you want, Kane?" Daniel glanced at Thor. Thor wasn't growling, but his body was low, ready to strike. Daniel smiled. "I want you to confess." Holloway laughed. "You think I'm going to—" Daniel cut him off. "I don't need you to." He pulled a small device from his pocket. A live stream, straight to every major news station in the country. The reporters, already watching. And Holloway? He finally understood. He had already lost. The moment Holloway lunged for his gun, Daniel whistled. Thor moved like a missile. The dog tackled Holloway to the ground, snarling, pinning the general with his weight. Daniel pressed his boot against Holloway's chest, staring down at the man who had stolen everything from him. "You tried to erase me," Daniel murmured. "Now, the whole world knows your name." Holloway struggled, growling. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Daniel smiled. "No," he said, "but you're done." 2 weeks later, Daniel stood at a cabin deep in the woods, overlooking a peaceful lake. Thor sat beside him, staring ahead, his tail wagging lazily. No more prison, no more running, no more war, just freedom. "You ready for a new life, buddy?" Daniel muttered. Thor thumped his tail once. Daniel smirked. "Yeah, me too." And together, they walked into the future,